All right, welcome guys to the next episode of the Matchroom Experience. Today we have a very special guest. We have Dr. John Veraeke. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
And you've done a lot of work in a lot of different fields. I see you teach cognitive science. Is that correct?
I teach both cognitive psychology and cognitive science at the University of Toronto. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And then you have a PhD in philosophy?
I have a MA and a BA in philosophy. I have a honors, like a specialist BSc in cognitive science.
Mm-hmm.
I did my PhD officially in philosophy, but it was a PhD on cognitive science.
Oh, okay. The way I found you, this might be interesting for you to hear, is one of my friends actually told me about you, your series, Awakening or From the Meaning Crisis.
Right. Yeah.
Now, this is something I feel like is very top of the mind in culture today. It just seems that this is something that's very rampant. Could you kind of describe what it is, just to give people an idea?
I'll try. I mean,
Yeah.
the series is 50 episodes, each an hour long.
Mm-hmm.
But I do get asked this question a lot. So, I mean, there's different ways of talking about. One way is talking about people's experience.
Mm-hmm.
People are experiencing themselves as sort of disconnected from themselves, from each other, from realness, a sense that they're sort of out of touch in a way that's nebulous, but nevertheless gnawing. And that often can become a kind of background nihilistic
Mm-hmm.
anxiety and concern.
Mm-hmm.
It expresses itself symptomatically in a whole bunch of things. You're getting
Mm-hmm.
even though worldwide suicide is going down amongst young people and certain groups going up, you get an increase. There's increased issues about depression and anxiety, mental health issues. Loneliness is growing. You get addiction, the addiction, opioid crisis. Addictions are spreading. People are vacating from the real world and spending more and more time in the virtual world because they're hungering from things that are lacking in the
Mm-hmm.
real world. But there's also positive aspects. There's people are um, they're taking up. There's the mindfulness revolution. There's the revival of ancient wisdom traditions like Stoicism. There's new practices emerging like circling. There's new venues like
Mm-hmm.
Rebel Wisdom or new channels
Mm-hmm.
like Paul Van Clay and Jonathan Pajot, myself, people talking about all of this in a pervasive way. So those are all the symptoms. There's also, and this is work I did with Christopher Mastropietro and Philip Misovec, there's sort of a mythological expression of the meaning crisis, which is the
Okay.
pervasiveness of the symbol of the zombie, because the zombie is basically a symbol of many aspects of this sense of meaninglessness, disconnection, directionlessness, the empty consumption and almost heedless self-destructive behavior. So the zombie is a pervasive cultural expression of this sense of meaninglessness that is gnawing away at people.
Okay. Now, I know this is going to be a bigger question, but there's probably many different reasons why this might be happening. But what are, it's happening more today, would you say, than it was 50 years ago?
Um, in one sense, so it's you could take a look. The series does a long argument, and you can see changes beginning in sort of the 12th century, and then
Oh, okay.
they get accelerated with the Protestant Reformation, the Scientific Revolution. The Industrial Revolution revs it up even more, and then the Computer Revolution, and then the Social Media Revolution. So all of these things have
Mm-hmm.
led to sort of a genealogy for how and why the meaning crisis has arisen. So that history is very long and complicated. That's why it takes
Right.
sort of 25 episodes to try and go through it. And then I supplement that with a lot of psychology and cognitive science of trying to understand, well, what is this meaning and what is the meaning making that's going on, and why is it under risk, and why is it being put at risk so deleterious to us?
Okay. And these are all such complicated topics. I find this very interesting because when I'm trying to ask you questions about this, I kind of realize that no matter how you answer or what I ask, you're going to need a lot more time, or it's a very complicated question, right?
Very much so. it's a profound question, and it's a pervasive question. That's why, I mean, that's why I made the series.
Right.
It's a
Hmm.
long, complicated argument with, a very significant history and also with a lot of complex cognitive science, intermeshed with, philosophical reflection to try and get a handle on this, and
Mm.
and not only on the meaning crisis itself, but how it might be really hamstringing us as we try to deal with what Thomas Bjorkman calls the meta crisis, sort of looming ecological issues, to how we're facing political polarization and gridlock. We got increasing socioeconomic disparity. There's a lot of other issues that are very pressing on us
Right.
in very threatening ways. And then the meaning crisis seems to be really, really curtailing our abilities to interact in a successful and wise manner with this. And that brings me to another aspect of the meaning crisis.
Uh-huh.
The very process, and comes out of the science, the very
Hmm.
processes that make us intelligently adaptive are also the same processes that make us prey to self-deception. And so cultures worldwide and through history have developed sets of practices for trying to ameliorate those self-deceptive, self-destructive patterns. And
Okay.
this goes under the term wisdom as distinct from knowledge, right?
Hmm.
What's happened is because of this history, we've lost touch with our wisdom traditions and our wisdom practices. Um, and so at precisely when we need the most wisdom we possibly could ever have for dealing with this meta crisis, we find ourselves deeply in the midst of a wisdom famine. We don't have wisdom traditions, we don't have wisdom institutions, and we don't have ecologies of wisdom practices. And so that's another way in which the meaning crisis is felt and experienced, and why it's exacerbating the meta crisis that we face. And so what happens is people you can't not try to deal with self-deceptive, self-destructive patterns. So
Right.
what people do is in a fragmented and autodidactic echo chambering way, they try to craft their own sort of set of ways of trying to come up with wisdom. And when they
Mm.
do
Okay.
that, they're not benefiting from two things. They're not benefiting from well vetted traditions in which people have practiced over millennia how
Uh-huh.
to cultivate wisdom, or from the best science we have, and I participate in this science, telling us what wisdom is and how it can be cultivated, what its relationship is to rationality, what its
Uh-huh.
relationship is to intelligence. And so they're doing a very suboptimal job at trying to address this issue, but they have no alternative. Many of them feel that the established religions are not viable for them. Many of them feel that the political ideologies of the 20th century drench the world in blood, and they don't want to get swept up in that kind of
Right.
totalitarian utopic vision. And so they feel trapped in sort of in their own little, overstrained and overburdened self,
Hmm.
trying to deal with this titanic issue.
And when you say they, you mean just generally people in general.
Yeah, and I hope you can understand that I'm trying to say something from a position of sympathy, not
Hmm.
condemnation.
Yeah. Hmm.
I see people's suffering and distress. I see it as people responding to the series. I see it as a professor. I see it as somebody who teaches meditation and contemplation
Uh-huh.
and Tai Chi. I
Hmm.
see it a lot, and I'm trying to respond to it.
Right. It's something that I mean I've probably gone through a little bit of this myself. I'm not sure if you have, where it's just kind of you're not really. I don't really know how to describe it. Where it's not like emptiness, but like you don't really know what to do. I don't know how to put it to words exactly. But
Yes.
one of the questions that came up for me there though is you're so right. The wisdom is very important to cultivate that. I remember in one of your episodes in your series, you were talking about Socrates. The unexamined life is not worth living.
Very
Right.
much. Yes. Yes.
We're being pulled by different kind of, I don't know the word used anymore, but kind of desires, but we don't know where they're coming from. It's if we're not. You get
Yeah.
something to say that?
Yeah, well, very much. I mean, so Socrates is very much about trying to deeply provoke people, not just at the level of their ideas, but at the
Mm-hmm.
level of their identities. How much they are disconnected from themselves, how much they find things salient without understanding why, and
Mm-hmm.
how much they are driven, right, in a very self-deceptive fashion, this way and that way, in ways that are often, mutually contradictory and undermining as they try right, to get to a place on their own. And it's very hard to do this on your own, to afford the kind of self-transcendence that's needed to really deal with these issues of self-deception and the way that self-deception disconnects us. And so Socrates is very much, in fact, the series that I'm making to follow up, so the series I'm working on now that will come after Awakening from the Meaning Crisis is called After Socrates, The Pursuit of Wisdom Through Authentic Dialogue. And I want to try and understand much more deeply what is it that Socrates is doing, and how can we tap into, right, this dialogical process, because we need to get out of the autodidactic monologic process, and we need to get back to where people are in deep dialogue with each other. And you see all this all over the place, where people are trying to get back to authentic discourse with circling practices, or you see what's happening with the whole series on rebel wisdom about collective intelligence. All of this, the fact that you and I are doing this right now is an instance of what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Right? That we're trying to break out of this. And so I'm trying to get at a much deeper understanding of that Socratic project, and then trying to bring it into discussion with all of these emerging practices and all these emerging forums.
That's very interesting. And you can see how, and just to make sure I'm not, what does autodidactic, does that mean kind of like
self-taught?
Self-taught. Okay, yeah. You can see how this kind of plays out. I watch a little bit of Jordan Peterson as well, and he talks a little bit about how there's people identifying at the level of the group versus the individual. And when you're doing it at the group level, you can kind of get into that. It's a kind of a pitfall you can fall into with that.
Well, you can fall into it in both. That's the problem. I mean,
okay.
So you can both. I think both a collectivism and a kind of liberal, small L, liberal individualism can exacerbate the cognitive biases that beset us. I don't think either one of these poles. This is that's so what I'm trying to see in something like Socrates is you have something much more like opponent processing. You have multiple positions, and they're all interacting and self-correcting. It's neither an individual nor is it a monolithic, mechanical solidarity of a collective. You're trying to get beyond both of those, because look, we human beings have evolved to do things in distributed cognition. Long before the internet webbed computers together, culture webbed brains together. Individually, we are not very powerful. But when you get a bunch of us and we can coordinate ourselves together and sharpen some sticks and get some dogs, and we can kill anything on the planet. And that's our primary culture, is our biggest adaptation. And so trying to get back to the conversational processes that actually drive and sustain and innovate culture. That's what I think Socrates was trying to do with his dialectical practices. And I want to try and understand that, and I want to try and use that template to understand what people are trying to do now as a way of trying to move us forward.
Oh, wow, that's a very complicated. Okay. So one of the things I was going to ask you when you were talking a minute ago is we have a little bit of a problem with cultivating wisdom. We're getting lost in that sense. So what you're saying right now, just to make sure I understand correctly, Socrates was saying this kind of dialogue was a way that we could cultivate wisdom by talking and connecting with that kind of culture mesh you were talking about. Is that on track so far?
Yeah. The idea is that the best way in which you can overcome your egocentric and autodidactic set of biases is to, in good faith, and I'm using that term very, very deeply, is to enter into good faith dialogue where both of you are committed, dialogos, the way of the logos. You're both committed to a self-organizing process of conversation and mutual disclosure, and also mutual argumentation and the mutual provocation of insight that can get us outside of that egocentrism and autodidactism and give us the potential to you primarily self-transcend through other people's perspectives.
Right. Okay. It's kind of like the idea of a sharp. What's the line where you put it to the heat of the fire and the best idea will come out?
Part of it is it's also, and this is something I'm talking about. It's not just the best idea comes out, because it's not just about ideas. It's about perspectives. It's about possible identities that people can aspire to. So it's not just about creating a theory. It's also about this dialectic allows you to cultivate your character, which I think is actually much more important if you read the Platonic dialogues, for example. And this is what got taken up in Stoicism. The discourse, the ideas, of course, they're necessary, but they're not central. What's central is a new way of life. And that comprehensively means new skills, new perspectives, and new roles, and fundamentally a new kind of character and identity that one has aspired to. Look, we might be born intelligent. We're not born rational. We have to aspire to rationality. Rationality has to be cultivated. Wisdom has to be cultivated. Virtue has to be cultivated.
Mm-hmm. And so, there's so many different. Would you say some virtues are more important, or?
So for me, I think of wisdom as very much like a meta virtue. That wisdom. So if let's say that well, this is what I argue that what rationality is, right? What rationality is rationality is you use your intelligence to learn better how your intelligence operates. And you use your intelligence to learn about these biases and learn how to look for them, how to correct for them, and how to aspire and identify with somebody who is more free from those biases. So rationality is this way in which you turn your intelligence recursively onto itself. So you bootstrap. Well,
Right.
wisdom is to take rationality and to bootstrap your rationality into something even deeper. And so, what wisdom is it's this sort of rationally self-transcending rationality that helps you to aspire in a developmental way, a dynamic and developmental way to all of the virtues. So if I want one way of being, think about it this way: when I'm being honest, that's one way of being wise in a particular situation, and being courageous is a way of being, and knowing which one of these virtues should be applied and which one should be. These are all. So wisdom is about aspiring, cultivating, and knowing when and how to apply the various virtues.
I really like that. I don't know the exact quote, but I do know. I think it was Aristotle that said it with the golden mean, where it's really easy to be angry, but it's really hard to know how long to be angry, who to be angry at what direction.
Exactly. So, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. It's not being angry or not being. It's not about being angry or not being angry. It's about, as you said, being angry at the right person for the right reason, to the right degree, for the right duration, that kind of thing. And now that sense of, that sensitivity is this the right context? Am I doing it to the right degree? See, that's not a matter of having the right ideas. That's a matter of having the right set of skills, the right set of situational awareness, the various perspectives that organize my situational awareness, and also the degree to which I've identified with a particular kind of character that I am trying to aspire towards. That's what you have to bring to bear to know, to be angry am I being angry at the right time, for the right reason, etc., etc. That's what's crucial there.
So just to make sure I understand correct, wisdom is basically kind of like the mediator that kind of helps you know how long, or like the balance that you should have in terms of, should be angry this turn long, or
both the mediator and the motivator.
Okay.
Right? And it's also meta, in that it's training all the skills and situational awareness and your sense of self in character that actually allows you to do that mediation and have the appropriate motivation.
Okay. Now, I like to make things really practical. That's one thing sometimes I get caught up and I'll make things a little too abstract. How would you, and this might be a hard question to answer again, but how would you practically say, for the average person watching, how do you get them to cultivate their wisdom?
Well, I mean, what you have to understand is that there's multiple different ways in which your cognition is making you adaptively intelligent. And so you've got to come up with sets of practices that coordinate between these different, I call them different ways of knowing, but different ways in which you are adaptively intelligent. So you want to I'll use the phrase, you want to learn to cultivate an ecology of practices. You want to have
Okay.
a set of practices that have complementary sets of strengths and weaknesses that
Hmm.
compensate and correct and constrain each other in a
Hmm.
self-correcting manner. So one of the things I want to do is at times I want to enhance my inferential abilities, my ability to make argumentation.
Hmm.
And what I want to do is I need to do that very step by step and carefully. And so I need to protect that from that part of my cognition that jumps to conclusions,
Oh, okay.
right? And so I have to cultivate a thing called active open-mindedness. I do this every day. What I do is I'll pick a cognitive bias or two, and I'll spend my day trying to notice it, like the confirmation bias or the representativeness bias or the my side bias or some of the more moral biases like egocentrism or narcissism. And then at the end of the day, I journal about that to see how well I've done on that. So I practice active open-mindedness to protect my inferential processing from leaping to conclusions. But I need exactly the opposite. Because sometimes what happens is
Mm.
I need an aha moment. I need insight. I need to jump out of the frame that I'm in to an alternative frame that can actually help me. Sorry, somebody keeps calling. That can actually help me, right? Break out of an inappropriate way in which I've misframed a problem. Then what I need to do is I need to enhance properly the jumping, the cognitive leaping aspect of my cognition, and put my inferential machinery on in background hold. I
Hmm.
don't try and right? That's what mindfulness does. So, for example, I want to do a mindfulness
Mm.
practice like meditation, but I also want to do active open-mindedness, and I have the two acting like checks and balances. But let's take a look within the mindfulness. I also want checks and balances. I want practices that move inward, my attention inward towards sort of the center of how my mind is working, and I want contemplative practices that take me far out into right my how my attention is directed to sort of the entire circumference of my worldview. And I need
Hmm.
to practice being able to move very fluently between them. So you need both
Okay.
meditative and contemplative practices. So I'm trying
Hmm.
to show you you need practices that are in this kind of dynamic relationship. And then even within the practice, you need sub practices that are in a dynamic relationships. Usually, that's why I use this metaphor of an
Hmm.
ecology. You need nested, right,
Yeah.
sets of these practices so you get them as self-correcting as possible.
And does that kind of relate to Jordan Peterson talks about the chaos and order within chaos and the Taoist, the yin and the yang, where you have
Well,
that kind of.
I think very much because what you're doing, right, is all of these practices they form a system, but there's fluidity in it. It's
Uh-huh.
dynamic, like in the Tao. I mean, I teach Tai Chi Chuan, right?
Okay.
So what you're doing is, right, by the way, in your ecology of practice, you should have a moving practice, like
Okay.
not just seated or intellectual practices. You need movement practices because you want to
Hmm.
get the cerebellum cortex loop properly attuned and trained.
I love
So
that. Okay.
but yeah, very much. So there's elements of chaos in it, like that's the fluidity. I would put it that you want this to be a dynamical system, not
Hmm.
just a static set right. It's got to be a dynamical system, and
Hmm.
it's always correcting. It's always shifting. There's always some criticality into it, and the system is always shifting, always breaking down a bit and then restructuring in
Uh-huh.
order to engage in this continual self-correction.
There's so many different ways I could take. I love this so much because it's it's interesting to me that this is very a complicated answer, right? It's a complicated question too, but one thing I think about that is how do you kind of, and I don't know the answers at all, but since it's so complicated, it's a lot harder to get other people to understand it, right? Just
Yeah.
like how do you kind of combat that? Because otherwise, it'd probably be better if everybody knew this, but or even understood. I don't think I completely understand it, but how do you?
Well, that's why I made a video series so people can watch it at their leisure and go over it
Right.
again, again, and
Mm-hmm.
again. That's why I do a lot of these interviews and get into a lot of these dialogues and lots of these discussions. And that's why I talk to other people who are creating these communities of practices and other people who are involved in this work, both scientifically and practically. And
Mm-hmm.
so, as much as I'm trying to create a vocabulary and a theoretical grammar so that we can get as clear about it as possible. That's how I try to deal with the fact that this is hard. But always, right, you have to remember that I'm always not just doing this as a theoretician. I practice and I teach people how to practice meditation, contemplation, Tai Chi Chuan. I'm going and getting involved with circling practices and some of the I'm participating in them and seeing how they're working. Like you have to do both the bottom up participation and you have to do the top down theorizing. And then you got to figure out how the best possible way. And I mean, I'm a teacher. I'm supposed to be good at this, right? You have to figure out the best way of both entering into dialogue with people and balancing that with the monologue where you're trying to present ideas to them so that they can learn how to better enter into the dialogue.
Okay. If we're just going to take a step back now, one thing that you brought up, it was psychotechnology. It was active open-mindedness.
Yes.
And I want to ask you more about that. But just before I do, could you kind of, just for people who don't know what a psychotechnology might be, how would you quickly or take
Yeah, so a psychotechnology is a socially generated way of formatting and formulating how you're going to do your information processing. It is designed to fit human cognition in such a way that, like a physical tool, analogous to a physical tool, it fits with how human cognition works, and it will reliably and systematically enhance it. And it has to be a way, like I say, a standardized way of formulating information processing and formatting information processing that's like it can be widely disseminated amongst your population, and people will deeply internalize it, and so that it can become automatic to them. So prototypical instances, it becomes second nature to them. Prototypical instances are things like literacy, especially alphabetic literacy or numeracy, but things like active open-mindedness. If you practice, like I said, doing this enough, eventually it becomes automatic and internalized to you, and it's socially generated because you have to learn from the scientific community what all the biases are and how to look for them and how to counteract them. And it's reliable, it's empirically experimentally based, so we know it can be widely generalized across the population, and we know that people can deeply internalize it.
Okay, and active open-mindedness, what exactly is that?
Well, that's what I just said to you. That's this idea of what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to train myself, and I'm trying to bring about a sensibility transformation, transcendence, where I'm training myself to become aware of things that normally I'm not aware of the heuristics I'm using. I'm aware through them, like my glasses, right? And so I don't notice when I'm doing the confirmation bias or when I'm doing the my side bias.
I see.
So what I have to do is train myself first to be able to, what you just said a minute ago, step back and see it. Can I step back and see it? Then, and that's not enough. And the next part is difficult too. Not only can I step back and see it, but can I actively counteract it? Because these things are powerfully compelling. Because they run off of, like, as I said, the very machinery that makes you intelligently adaptive is the same machinery that makes you subject to self-deception. So these processes are very hard to counteract, and there's a recursive element in it. You have to know when and where, like Aristotle's anger. You have to know where and when and what degree to counteract these. That's active open-mindedness.
And I really found it interesting there. When you said what active open-mindedness, it means taking a step back. Earlier, you mentioned how meditation or mindfulness is a very important kind of fit with it. That probably helps with taking a step back with the...
It does. So these processes, that's why I say, are in a complementary relationship. So active open-mindedness and mindfulness are sort of in opponent processing in that active open-mindedness emphasizes inference and sort of tries to reduce background, the cognitive leaping. Mindfulness tend to emphasize insight, and so it's to foreground the leaping and background the inference. That's why you try to shut off all that chatter in your head. But they also share that's how they can be connected. They share this, right? That for both of them, you have to pay attention to how you're paying attention.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I love that. Now, I just want to make sure I understand it right. Psychotechnologies, to me, I mean, active open-mindedness, maybe I knew it unconsciously, but I didn't until it was brought to my conscious awareness, I might not have been practicing it.
Yes.
And it's probably useful for me to practice it.
You have to learn it. You have to learn it and practice it. Looks like you had to learn and practice literacy.
Is there other psychotechnologies that you would bring up for somebody who might not be aware of them that you would think would be useful for their life?
Well, as I said, I think all the mindfulness
Uh-huh.
psychotechnologies, meditation. It follows that definition I just gave you.
Hmm.
Contemplative practices. I do Tai Chi Chuan. It's a moving practice. That's a psychotechnology for getting into the flow state, and you should try and get into the flow state
Oh,
as much as
interesting.
you possibly can. So, what are the psychotechnologies that reliably help get us into the flow state? You should also, right? There's all many different other individual psychotechnologies, but just to make sure we're canvassing all the types.
Hmm.
You also want to get into psychotechnologies for distributed cognition, like so trying to figure out, as I said, Socrates was inventing a psychotechnology, dialectic. What was going
Mm.
on there?
Hmm.
How can we bring back a psychotechnology for interpersonal dialogue that takes the collective intelligence of interpersonal dialogue and bootstraps the collective intelligence into collective rationality and collective wisdom?
I love that. Yeah, that seems way more important now. Now that you really, I got a better understanding. That's very cool. Um, as for the flow state, we should get in the flow state. Can you go into kind of like why?
Well, so this goes to work that I published with Leo Ferraro and
Uh-huh.
Elaine Hera Bennett on that. When you're in the flow state, basically what you're doing, I would argue, and we would argue, that
Right.
what you're doing is you're getting into a state in which you're sort of training your insight machinery to cascade, and you're training your intuition to pick up on very complex patterns, and you're training those two things in a highly integrated manner. So what you're doing is it's like, think about a jazz musician playing, right? They're picking up
Mm-hmm.
on very complex patterns, but they're also getting, a series of like aha moments that's making them help them to innovate and restructure those patterns. So they're intuitively picking up on complex patterns and then insightfully restructuring them, and then using that to pick up on new patterns.
Uh-huh.
So what? Why is that important? Because if you're in the flow state, what you're getting, your brain, our brains have evolved, Csikszentmihalyi argues, to give us the feedback that you do more of what you're doing right now because you're in the conditions that really optimize that ability to get an insight cascade and to enhance your intuitive ability to pick up on complex pattern, and doing it in a really, really powerful way. And so that is really going to really help your overall meaning making machinery. That's why the ability to get into the flow state is predictive of your subjective sense of well-being, and it's predictive of how meaningful you find your life.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Work that I'm currently doing with Daniel Gregg and Madeline Ebremian is the idea that things like insight and flow, they're using the same machinery, and that same machinery is also going into mystical experiences and awakening experiences. My lab at Toronto, we ran a large MTurk study showing that when people have mystical experiences, they regard their lives as more meaningful, precisely because a mystical experience is kind of like a super flow experience, and it puts you into this it really helps you get beyond your egocentrism in a very powerful way and get this
Mm-hmm.
deep sense of connectedness, and get a sort of a comprehensive and powerful flow state going. So that's very important for optimizing that machinery and getting the feedback that you're really well connected to yourself and the world.
Okay. And with the flow state, that's a form of psychotechnology. Is that right?
No, well, flow state isn't a psychotechnology. Flow state is a state. The
Okay.
psychotechnology that gets it. So jazz, think
Mm-hmm.
about music, is the like not the music, but I mean
Yeah.
like the skill of playing jazz. That's what I'm
Mm-hmm.
trying to say. That's a psychotechnological practice insofar as we can learn it in the ways that I've talked about. Now, obviously, there's an individual skill component, and I don't want to
Uh-huh.
identify
Yeah.
them. So let's use something that I think is more clearly a psychotechnology, which is something I mentioned, Tai Chi Chuan. So, right, this is a Taoist psychotechnology. Its primary function is to get you into the flow state, right?
Oh,
So
really?
it's a psychotechnological practice that
Mm-hmm.
pretty reliably gets you into the flow state. It's socially created. It's not natural. Human beings don't naturally do Tai Chi Chuan, right?
Right.
Right? And so, right, and it's highly standardized. It's even ritualized, but it's internalizable, it's generalizable, and it systematically and reliably gets people into the flow state.
Now, this could what's coming to my mind right now is just kind of relates to the thought we were having earlier, where we kind of get pulled towards things that are salient. could that kind of happen with the flow state as well, for
Oh,
example?
oh, for sure. It
Go
does.
for it. Yeah.
And so one of the most reliable ways, I think I want to talk about this more generally, of getting into flow state is to play a video game because it triggers all
Yeah.
the, right, and it gets you into the flow state. And the problem with the video game is it gets you in a flow state to an environment that actually has the long-term effect of disconnecting you from the real world. And let's look at these video games. Let's look at why people are hungry for them. So they're finding in video games something that's missing in the real world. Well, what's in a video game? Well, there's a clear narrative that you belong to and participate in and make a difference to. There's a clear set of rules so the world is comprehensible and intelligible to you. You understand how it fundamentally operates. And there is a reliable way in which you can self-transcend and become wiser. You can level up. And so you get a flow state in an artificial world that is offering you all the dimensions of meaning that are lacking from the real world. And that's why you get something like video game addiction. The WHO is seriously considering making video game addiction a bona fide medical disorder.
That's so interesting. So it's basically like hijacking your mental machinery in a certain sense.
All addiction hijacks your adaptive machinery. That's why you find it compelling. If it
Right.
wasn't hijacking adaptive machinery, it wouldn't be so compelling to
That
you.
makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty. So I don't know if this is your expert. What would you do? What do you do because of this? So we know that video games can hijack your machinery. Should we still play them, or anything that could be like addiction? Moderation is the
Well,
key, or
moderation's the key, but
Mhm.
what our culture has to get better at is, and this is what the religious and wisdom traditions used to do, giving people opportunities to get into the flow state in the real world that helps them cultivate wisdom and self-transcendence.
How could we?
That's
Oh yeah, that's a. Could you think of any way? How like could you give me an example? Like how could we do that? Even if we,
well, I mean, part of it is to take a look at these religious traditions like Taoism and Buddhism and Christianity, especially Neoplatonic Christianity and like Sufism within Islam. How did they get people into these flow states and link that to the cultivation of wisdom and self-transcendence and finding a depth of connection to the real world? Well, we have lots of templates for that. What we need to do, and this is part of what I'm exploring, I explored in the meaning crisis, awakening from the meaning crisis, and what I'm doing in all these dialogues I'm having with people right now and the work I'm doing on the next series is, okay, how do we do that? How do we create that kind of like that sort of religious ecology of practices that, right, that would be viable for many people who see themselves as post-religious and not wanting to return to a traditional religious format. So trying to work out how can I take what we were talking about earlier, that science of an ecology of practices, and then look at these wisdom and religious traditions and try and say, okay, how can we coordinate that ecology of practices, like I said, so we can bring in cultivation of flow state, but flowing within the real world so that you're actually cultivating wisdom.
Okay, and in the past that was done through kind of traditions and wisdom to be passed down, and that would kind of
Well, that's what religions did for us.
fair enough.
So there's kind of a family resemblance here. There's religions, and then they overlap with sort of philosophical ways of life. So is Buddhism a religion or is it a philosophy? I think that's a useless question. It's kind of both, right,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
neither,
Yeah.
right? And there's aspects of both of these, even in things that are more orthodoxly, nice pun, recognized as religions. I mean, even within Christianity, there's all of the stuff that's sort of more clearly or commonly, perhaps is a better word, designated as religious. But there used to be, and there still is for many people are tapping into this now within Christianity. There's extensive wisdom traditions within Christianity itself. So that's why I'm using that sort of hybrid, looking at the religions and the wisdom traditions because they intermesh in a lot of ways to try and get a better sense of what was going on.
Okay. I have a funny question now here. I got it from the YouTube comments in one of your videos. I saw it. I didn't know what to say to it. And I don't know how you could answer it, but I'm going to ask it to you.
Okay.
And somebody commented, who or what is the I that is cultivating character?
So that goes towards a very difficult question about the nature of the self. And the problem for us is we use that term and we want to use that term as if it has a single stable, right, static referent that
Uh-huh.
I'm pointing to, like the soul of John, if you'll allow me to
Right.
speak
Mm-hmm.
first person. But that's not appropriate. There's one meaning of your sense of self is whatever those sets of constraints are that basically organize your cognition into a cognitive agent. And I can't go into that in great detail now.
Mm-hmm.
And so there, in that sense of yourself, that self-organizing dynamical system that couples, right, to the couples your body together and couples your embodied brain and body to the world, right, in a dynamic that structural functional organization of that dynamical system that affords ongoing cognitive agency, ongoing intelligent agency. That's a
Mm-hmm.
sense of yourself, but right, that's very different from the autobiography that you right have
Mm-hmm.
that you identify with.
Mm-hmm.
It's very different from how that process of self-organization comes into consciousness. And so you have right you're a center of your perspectival knowing, and we treat all of these as if they're identical. The center of my dynamical salience landscaping, right, the thing that grounds my cognitive agency and my personal narrative autobiography. We treat them as if they're all pointing to the same thing. They're
Mm-hmm.
not, because they come apart from each other in things like the flow experience. When you're in the flow experience, that dynamical sense of self really takes priority. And then the consciousness is much more sort of being receptive, and the narrative ego is completely silenced. It's gone away. And
Mm-hmm.
so you're getting a lie. You get sorry you It's exactly the wrong thing. You're being shown the lie that, oh, all of these three things are one and the same thing, and they're not. They're not.
Mm-hmm.
Your agency can actually be enhanced when that narrative, status-seeking, autobiographical, self-writing story actually falls silent, and your that center of consciousness shifts in flow. It's not here in me. It's I get a tremendous sense of at one mint with the world, and the world, as opposed to John, becomes super salient. I become reality centric rather than egocentric.
I love that. Oh yeah, and I love how you just separated into three different kind of beings, and that
Yeah.
beautifully painted the picture from my mind at least. We're coming up on the end here though, so I don't have anything else. Is there anything you would want to add on to the end of what you just said?
No, I don't think so. Like I said, the shameless plug for my next
Yeah.
series
Mm-hmm.
after Socrates, which I've already talked about. But other than that, I don't have anything else to say. I think you asked some excellent questions. I hope you found my answers helpful.
Absolutely. So, if anybody wants to reach out to you, where can they go?
So they can, there's contact information, I think, on the videos, in the video series. If they want to contact me and get more direct contact, they can support me on Patreon. They can go to my Patreon channel, and for small donations, they get some contact, they get priority. I have every month, I have a Q&A, and if you are a Patreon supporter, your questions get privilege. And then if you're at a higher tier of Patreon support, I'll do like this. I'll meet with you and talk with you virtually for an hour, do some email exchanges with you, etc.
Mm-hmm. All right, and I'll leave a link down below, so if anybody wants to check that out, they can. So thanks
Great.
for listening, guys. That's the end of this show. Please leave a like, subscribe, and please check out John Veraeke. He's excellent. Just check the links out. I'll put it all down there for him. And yeah,